Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your very kind introduction. I'm so delighted to be here with Carlo Ratti. And before we begin, please give a very warm welcome to Carlo Ratti.
Oh, to Hans.
And as you heard, there are many dimensions to Carlo's practice as an architect, as a trained engineer, of course, as a professor at MIT, as the founder of his own studio in Torino, as a technologist, as an urbanist, and now, of course, also as a curator of the next Architecture Biennale. We're going to speak very fast so that in 60 minutes we can cover all the dimension of Carlo's practice. And I wanted to begin with something which played a role at the very beginning, Carlo, of your practice. You were very inspired by Carlo Scarpa, and something Carlo Scarpa, the legendary Italian architect, once said, "Tra un albero e una casa, scegli l'albero." Between a tree and a house, choose the tree. Can you tell us a little bit about that sentence? Because in many ways, it's a segue into our topic, because we're going to talk about, the different forms of intelligences in your work: natural intelligence, artificial intelligence, collective intelligence, the topic also of your Venice Biennale, and of course, the intelligence of trees in that quote is a great beginning.
Yeah, thank you, Hans, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I love that quote by Carlo Scarpa, between a house and a tree, I picked the tree. But I think it actually looks at one of the issues of architecture in the 20th century, about this kind of juxtaposition and kind of fighting between the world of the natural and the world of the artificial. The world of the artificial being, if you take Herbert Simon definition, being about, our cities, our buildings, our objects, and so on. And so I think, one of the things about the Venice Biennale this year, will open on the 10th of May. You're all invited. The pre-opening is the week before. And it's really about how we can put together different types of intelligence. Initially, I wanted to call the Biennale NI, Natural Intelligence. When everybody talks about AI, can we actually, in the end, the title is Intelligence, Natural, Artificial, Collective, but really about, perhaps, how we can go back to Scarpa and combine better the house and the tree.
Thank you so much. And we wanted to talk about sort of different aspects of your practice. And one thing which, of course, brings us right away from the tree to your environmental work is a big project you're doing in Helsinki called the Decarbonization project. It's a very collective project. It's a project also which brings in technology really to address the climate emergency. Can you tell us more about what's happening in Helsinki and where you develop a model there which really can also be applied, of course, to other places in the world?
Yeah, well, Helsinki started with a competition run by the mayor of Helsinki. Actually, quite a brave competition. When you look at cities are, the way they do things is usually the opposite of innovation. And let me elaborate a bit on that. It's, when we look at cities, when they need to do a project, they usually look at best practices. But if you think about it, what is a best practice? It means that another city, probably 20 years before, had an idea, then they designed it, they built it and something. It was successful. And well, if you follow best practices, what you do? You take that and you repeat it. So best practice or thinking, that mindset, is about locking the future into the past. It's about, learning from the past, and you continue to perpetuate that. And we could argue that because of some of the urgency, your favorite word about it's urgent, or certainly climate change and adapting to a changing environment is something where we cannot continue just by perpetuating and taking lessons from the past and moving them into the future. So that brings me to the fact that I thought was very brave, and that's why we got interested in the competition, that the mayor of Helsinki decided to take a different approach from the city level that is more similar to the X Prize in the US. As you know, the X Prize Foundation, they put a big prize on the table. There's a difficult problem that a team all over the world compete, and then somebody in the end will win it. And well, that is what they did. They called it the Energy Challenge in Helsinki. 250 groups all over the world, like big companies, engineers, architects, and so on. They're usually very interdisciplinary teams. And yes, our project, one of the winners, looks at what you're saying is a large decarbonization effort. In a nutshell, without getting too much into the detail, is about today in Helsinki, there's good news and bad news. The good news is there's district heating. As you might know, district heating is good. You produce power and with some of the hot water that you generate, you heat the city. But the bad news is that a lot of the power generation is actually through coal. And so the idea here was, the question of the challenge was, how can we heat a city such as Helsinki in a sustainable way? And the solution was, well, storing energy as heat with kind of floating island becomes very cheap. And so basically what you're doing, you're getting renewables. When you got too much production, like in Germany sometimes, you get negative, even negative energy prices. But anyway, to turn it into heat, you store it, and then you run it through the city. So that's in a nutshell the project. But for me, the interesting thing is how can we actually turn cities into labs? And that's what we want to do also in Venice. And how can we accelerate the way we can find solutions for hopefully, solutions for an environment that can become more hostile in the future.
And in the city as a lab, and the Biennale as a lab, and then in your lab, the MIT lab, and also your lab in Torino, which I visited the other day, you of course work a lot with data. And over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about the importance of memory from several artists. We had a gaming panel with Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley and Leo Castañeda, who both talked about memory this morning. We had Philippe Parreno, whose exhibition at the Haus der Kunst. Yep. For those of you who haven't seen it, you should not miss. It's an incredible show. And Philippe talked about his unrealized project to address, forgotten things. Now, I wanted to ask you as well to talk maybe in the context of data and the importance of data in your lab about two positions from the past who might not be so present today, in the memory of data and urbanism, but who are real pioneers and worked with data at the time when it was much, much more difficult than in our age. And that's, of course, William White, whom I haven't thought about for ages. I read his book when I was a student, but it's great that you bring him back. And then, of course, also Kevin Lynch. So the future can be invented with fragments from the past.
Well, Hans, we should actually say to share with people a bit more about William White, but you're right, very excited you mentioned William White. William White, probably 50 years ago, started going around New York and documenting at the time with cameras, life in the city, then to analyze it. But he says, if you look at his book, the one you mentioned, he says, there's a big issue is the analysis. At the time, everything had to be manual. You had to get the footage and then annotate it manually and so on. And fast forward 50 years, and today you can do exactly the same thing, but automate it with digital data and with AI, as you're saying. That's kind of the idea at the very beginning when with Asaf Biderman, who's here, and then we started Senseable City Lab, is how the new data can help us to better understand different dimensions of the city. If you can measure that, then hopefully you can also fix some of the problems we have. So that's how William White today could really, today we can actually use new technologies to bring William White and his approach, or you said Kevin Lynch as well, but to a totally different new situation thanks to digital.
And now talking about the lab, we of course want to hear all more about the Biennial. As a lab, you use the Architecture Biennale in Venice, which will begin in April this year, as a lab to address basically different forms of intelligence. It's called INTELLIGENS, and of course, that includes also the syllable gens for people. And you sort of told me that there are these three chapters, right? There is the natural intelligence, the artificial intelligence, and the collective intelligence. And before we talk about these things more in detail, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the title and this sort of overall notion. And it's, of course, much more than just artificial intelligence. It's about many different, we began with the intelligence of a tree. It's different forms of intelligence.
Okay, first of all, the first thing to say is that we open in May, not in April. I was saying, it's already very short.
Which date is it?
It's on the 10th of May, and the week before is when all the opening and so on. So
we all have to be in Venice on the 10th of May.
Well, actually, 4 days before, when all the previews are. No, you're right. I think intelligence. So we went back. Usually, the Biennale has the title in Italian and the title in English, but we actually took the common root, this intelligence, and we like, as you said, this idea of gens, which is multiplicity. So how we can put together different type of intelligence. And if you need to probably take away one thing from the Venice Biennale this year is that architecture has been engaging with mitigation for a long time. It is important. There's a lot of CO2 emissions that are related to architecture. But the truth is actually for mitigation, architecture is one of the players. You got many other players. You got industry, transport, energy production, you name it. There's many other components there. But actually when you look at mitigation, when you look at adaptation, when you look at how we can deal with what had just happened in Los Angeles, with the floods we had in Europe, in Valencia, in many parts of Europe, just a few months ago, well, for adaptation, architecture is the only hope. When I say architecture, is architecture, engineering, and basically reshaping the built environment. And so what we want to do in Venice is actually look at how different type of intelligence and coming together from different disciplines, we can actually, hopefully, learn how to adapt to a climate that can be more hostile. And, if you look at the beginning of architecture, architecture starts when climate is against us. The Abbé Lauget in France in the 18th century really looks at a primitive hut. It's just a simple way to protect us from rain and from the environment. And so somehow it's going back to the roots of architecture and seeing how, in a similar way to what you were saying about William White, how we can adapt them to today's time.
And then the question, of course, of the methodology. If you want to address the big challenges of the 21st century, as your biennial does, I mean, we can only do that if we go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, right? So it has to be a transdisciplinary approach, collaborations between lots of different professionals. A second part of the methodology you said is the living lab, and that's also interesting because we heard just an hour ago, from Philippe Pareno, that the artwork and the exhibition in the digital age are more and more becoming living organisms. They're not finite categories.
Yeah.
So obviously the exhibition, I suppose, will change. And then there is, of course, the whole collaborative participatory aspect of the methodology with your space of ideas. And there is a fourth element, which I haven't yet fully understood, and you might explain it to us, which is the circularity protocol. Can you talk to us a little bit, or tell us a little bit about these four passes, in a way, to solutions: transdisciplinarity, living lab, space for ideas, and then last but not least, the circularity protocol.
Yeah, so for the space for ideas is something we did. Usually the Biennale, and the director of Biennale has kind of a top-down approach. It's about you select a number of people that will take their work to Venice, and Venice becomes a way again to showcase what the curator, the director thinks are the most interesting and exciting things happening in architecture. But it's really quite top-down. It's a traditional curatorial approach. And so this year we tried something a bit different. We tried to have an open call. Again, it's related to what you were saying, this fluid idea of the exhibition, and getting a lot of bottom-up input. Now, that was both amazing, incredible, and terrifying. Terrifying because we got flooded with thousands and thousands and thousands of submissions and emails from all over the world, but incredibly rewarding because we've been able to find a lot of people we've never been able to find in other ways, like young graduates from the other side of the world with great ideas that will be in Venice next year. And so this is kind of the open call, and the open call is a way, again, to combine this top-down and bottom-up. About the other things you're saying, maybe just a couple of comments. One, you said about the living lab, where Venice is probably the most fragile city in the face of climate change. Today, Venice is dry. There's a system many of you might have heard about called the MOSE. It's a system of mobile dams. And that actually keeps Venice dry today, so much so that people are going back to live on the ground floor of buildings that they had abandoned for a long time. But actually, the MOSE will not last forever. It will last probably for 50, depends who you talk to, for 50 or 100 years. Then sea level will be so high that the MOSE will not work enough. And so we thought that Venice was the perfect place to try to see how architecture could come up with ideas to help Venice, but then also ideas that could be scaled up at the scale of the planet. So that's kind of the idea of living lab. Venice is the most fragile city in the face of climate change, could become the place where we can look at how architecture can help in terms of adaptation.
The protocol, the circularity protocol.
The circular protocol, because you're very puzzled by that. The circular protocol is, something I always hated about temporary things. Temporary things can be an expo, can be the Olympics, can be, Venice Biennale, can be Milan Design Week. You do a lot of things. You build a lot of things, almost like a small city. And then after, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 6 months, everything goes to landfill. And so we waste a lot of things. And so what we did was team up with Ellen MacArthur and her foundation and with Arup, and we actually tried to see, can we turn the Venice Biennale into something totally circular? And I think next year will not be probably 100% perfect yet, but I think everybody, we somehow not force, but basically push everybody to try to make sure that what they build then can be recycled, reused, sold, moved somewhere else. So there's all these things. One of my favorite ones is actually, usually in biennales, you got a lot of plaster boards. And in this case, we're actually going to use reconstituted timber pieces that actually come from old furniture. There's a company that takes a lot of old furniture, quite a big company, and shreds it in order to do new boards for furniture. And so we're going to do this, and then at the end of the Biennale, again, we'll shred it and turn it into something else. So somehow, the idea that everything that we build, hopefully, should have a new life after the Biennale.
And then, of course, there is a whole chapter. We talked about natural intelligence, but there's a whole chapter on artificial intelligence. And you kind of say that, it addresses, of course, the question how the profession, the architectural profession, will change when generative models can produce construction drawings from simple text. How do you see that happen right now?
Well, we've always seen over the past couple of years how you can now just give the description and you turn it into an image, or you get an AI system to turn it into an image. I think every design office is doing that at the beginning to get inspiration when you do a design. It's kind of, in the past it was, you would maybe do 100 Google searches to get some inspiration, and now you got probably 100 million synthesized in this kind of image or something else. But everybody's already working on, can you go all the way? And you can go from the description, not only to the image. I mean, we know image, we know video now, since a few weeks, but can you that go all the way to BIM, to the building information model? Basically you describe your building and you go there. And for me, it's interesting because I would say, for me, the way I see it is that this AI is like, in French, you would say an idiot savant, something that knows everything about everybody and can do it, but what it cannot do is actually show and combine and synthesize what hasn't been done yet. So somehow it forces us to focus on the innovation side. We can actually somehow navigate, browse the past in a much better way than with traditional Google. But actually what it leaves to us and to architects is actually to do what hasn't been yet. And so I think that's something that probably will emerge through some of the projects at the Biennale.
Amazing. We have time for two last very quick questions. One is my favorite, Rainer Maria Rilke question. I see some young architects here, and Rainer Maria Rilke wrote the book, Advice to a Young Poet. In this age of natural, artificial, and collective intelligence, what would be your advice in 2025 to a young architect?
We probably, as you said, to actually try to combine, try to go beyond the disciplinary boundaries and basically use architecture as an aggregator, again, for something probably the most important challenge we have today, and it's about adaptation.
Last question is the unrealized project. And it's kind of funny that I ask you as an architect about that because, I always ask this question to artists, designers, poets, writers, because they never publish their unrealized projects. Architects, of course, do publish their unrealized projects. Nevertheless, I was curious, within the kind of realm of the unbuilt, what's the kind of percentage of realized and unrealized in your work? And can you tell us about one of your favorite unrealized projects?
Yeah, I'll tell you in a second. By the way, Hans, as we are saying, this is about collaboration, open up, and so on. Also, we want one question or one comment from the floor.
That's a great idea.
To finish. But about unrealized, I think you were kind of involved in not realizing that project. Remember the project for the Olympics in London?
Yeah.
That basically we had this kind of idea that there was a competition that Hans Ulrich was heavily involved at the time. We all got a letter from the mayor of London at the time, Boris Johnson, saying, well, we got the Olympics, so we should do. The letter says something like an Eiffel Tower for London. It was a beautiful competition, and the cloud was one of the finalists that had to be built, and then we didn't make it. So that's probably something that could have been very interesting to play with digital physical realities hovering over Hyde Park in London.
A mixed reality cloud. So let's take one or two questions. It's a great idea. Do we have questions or comments for Carlo?
Yes. Maybe just do like this and I will repeat the question, yeah.
Yeah, my question is, I'm not sure if you've seen the new Francis Ford Coppola movie, The Megalopolis.
Yeah.
Like the main gist is that an architect is building like a living city.
Yeah.
Do you relate somehow, like, do you see it happening like soon, or like, what do you think about it?
Well, let me tell you something. This is about the question, if you haven't heard it behind, but it's about the Coppola movie, how we relate to that. Now, I got something, I cannot do any spoiler about the Biennale. I think there's always, every audience, there's a Biennale lawyer who's listening about what I'm saying. I signed an NDA, so I cannot tell you much, but it's certainly something we're discussing right now. And we'll see some related things at the Biennale.
And of course, interesting in relation to the unrealized project, because it was Coppola's unrealized project to make this film, and then he decided to finance himself and make it happen, right? We can take one last question or comment. Yes, here in the first row.
Just a comment. Would you do what you were going to do in London for the Los Angeles Olympics?
It would be very interesting, yes, to think about it. I mean, probably adjusted. Every project usually follows a certain moment in time, but totally. Thank you.
This is wonderful, because this is why we are talking about unrealized projects as DLD, because very often exactly that happens. They then happen. So thank you all so much. Big round of applause for Carlo Ratti.
I'll do.
Thank you. That's great.